1. This afternoon session panel will be dealing with emergencies, humanitarian emergency actions, and we will give the example of the crisis in Ukraine. This is something that happened very suddenly, and there was great mobilization of individuals, institutions, the media, and we will be talking about multi-stakeholder partnerships, and this is the topic of our panel. We will see how NGOs, French institutions concluded partnerships in order to bring their own expertise. We are here to use the example of Ukraine to talk more broadly about the multi-stakeholder approach in a context of humanitarian emergencies and the various issues that may stem from this, and what are the best practices in order to have a more efficient and more impactful multi-stakeholder partnership. We have with us Frédéric de Saint-Cernin, who is from Acted, Deputy CEO, and have been in Ukraine since 2015. We also have representatives of two organizations who have worked with Acted. First, Anne-Claire Rigaud-Pouget, who is the head of social commitment at Chanel. Hello. And then we have Yves Benchimol, who is the CEO and co-founder of WeWard, and we will talk about what you're doing. And then we also have the privilege of having with us Céline Beaujolin, who is the executive director of Habitat and Humanism, another NGO working with refugees in France. Before we give you the floor, we will first watch a testimony of Acted members in Ukraine to see how they are working.
For Acted's response inside Ukraine. So prior to the invasion in February, Acted had been working in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. After the invasion, Acted scaled up its response to provide humanitarian assistance throughout the entire country. So this includes to displaced people, for example, in west and central parts of the country, and those who remain in active conflict areas or close to active conflict areas in the east and the south.
In the context where international actors has limited access and require time to scale up, local organizations, local civil society, self-help groups, volunteer, and local business play a crucial role on provision of humanitarian assistance to the conflict-affected areas, as well as to the internally displaced people and hosting communities. That is why cooperation with them allows to address humanitarian needs faster. Acted has been already working with various local partners in Ukraine since 2015, but since the armed conflict escalated, Acted expanded its strategic partnership with a wider network and local organizations across Ukraine, local business, civil societies, volunteer groups, initiatives, and self-help group, which enable us to support local response and provide food, non-food items, hygiene kits, food kits, and other essential items for people living in directly conflict-affected and hard-to-reach areas in Ukraine. Acted operates in two phases in the approach to partnership. Phase 1, it was a rapid, immediate provision of financial support to self-helpers group. During the period of March-May 2022, Acted adopted flexible model to subgranting with different local partners, civil societies, and business, etc., in order to respond rapidly and effectively. During this period, Acted managed to cooperate with more than 25 different organizations who did hot meal distribution to the people in train station, people in transit, at border checkpoints, and collective center next to humanitarian headquarters where people usually used to come for assistance. Through local partners, more than 20,000 affected people were assisted with essential needs. And phase 2, that was standardization and progressive cooperation with local partners using the grant agreement. Acted recognized that more robust process for the selection, contracting, and follow-up are required to build more efficient and impact and accountability to the partnership. Acted has developed 3 different categories of local partners contracting depending on the type of entity and their activities and amount of grant. Overall, we have cooperated with more than 30 organizations in this way. In addition to the financial support, ACT did distribution of humanitarian assistance that came with humanitarian convoy, private donation from French people. We managed to deliver the most needed stuff to people living in places of constant sharing. It is mostly east and north and south. All this assistance was done mostly through the local partners. Around 60 trucks of food, blankets, hygiene, clothes, furniture, animal food we distributed to the most vulnerable people. With this support, we managed to partner roughly 60 organizations, with most of whom we keep cooperating using grant agreement, as they proved to be capable, reliable, and able to provide more comprehensive assistance to the hard-to-reach communities.
Now, moving forward, the types of assistance that we'll provide with these contributions are things like water trucking to frontline areas and multi-purpose cash assistance to evacuees from occupied areas.
We also do not miss to support local authorities. Every day we receive numerous requests from those authorities whom we partnered in our previous activities, from the hosting communities all over Ukraine. And using this convoy, we managed to establish good relationship with local authorities, and we all the time in touch with them to learn their needs and try to address them. We are planning to do more efficient activities with partners and to develop competencies and skills that can make them more effective and sustainable, providing capacity building, training and activities. We want to increase their potential for charitable non-profits to enrich lives and solve society's most crucial problems.
Alors vous l'avez entendu, hein.
As you just heard, this action from Acted in Ukraine has been carried out as close as possible to the local populations. It was very fast because they were already present in the east of the country before the crisis started in February. Frédéric de Saint-Servin, could you give us a summary of the various actions which were carried out in Ukraine? Yeah, this documentary shows what we have done, but you insisted on the fact that an NGO has to know the territory very well, has to know the communities to be able to act in war zones and areas. This is very difficult. The advantage with Acted is that we've been there since 2015. We all know Donbass now, but we were there already. We have 3 offices there, from that region to Mariupol. That region, of course, has become more than a war zone. The war has extended. First of all, the conflict was nationalized, then the war focused on the east and the south of the country. So Acted was able, therefore, to implement an emergency response pretty much in all the country, which is important to note. We have to be able to help and rescue people, the suffering populations, not just where we are based, but everywhere. So we have to leave that zone, which was a particular area of conflict, to act all over the country. Therefore, it was important, and this was well stated in our documentary. We were able to develop partnerships with the intervention teams, which are Ukrainians. These are people who know the field well, who know the populations and the needs. And it was through our partnerships with these people that we could be more efficient. We have several employees who are working on the field in Ukraine. We recruited more staff in order to meet the needs. What have been our responses? We can see 3 types of zones. The occupied zones, with first need emergencies, hygiene, food, hot meals, etc. Now, for the last 7 or 8 months, we have to remember that it started in the winter season. Winter in Ukraine is very, very cold. We had to bring blankets, so we had to take actions very quickly in order to support municipalities, local actors, and to give out fuels. During a conflict period, people want to leave, some want to stay, but some want to leave the region. So we had to support these people. So ACTID really played a great role in that sense. Here we're talking about the occupied regions. Now you have the other regions, which is the rest of Ukraine, which may have been bombarded at times, where people were fleeing to. So I'm insisting on the fact that people who are being displaced, we're talking here about several millions of people from Ukraine. Never did we ever see such great numbers of people who were fleeing to other regions, to other countries at the borders. This is a first example as such, which is a great lesson for humanitarian NGOs to learn how to act in emergencies situations, which is the heart of our mission in the south and in the west, to make it short. Then we came along to support other local public actors that were helping hundreds of thousands of refugees in terrible conditions. They had to be housed. Some had families, others did not have families and were housed in public buildings, schools, gymnasium, churches, public buildings, which were not necessarily fit for receiving these people. So we had to be there to help with the rehabilitation of these public facilities, to open up new facilities such as toilets, and we had to welcome the Ukrainian refugees as normal human beings. It was important to be able to meet the needs of women, of handicapped people as well. We had to rehabilitate some of those buildings and to open up facilities. And this is not something that public like to hear, but we had to do cash transfer. This is something that people don't like to hear, but we have to give money to people directly so that they can meet their own needs. And this is important in order to make the market work. This is something that is enabling us to activate all these elements. I'm saying that people don't like to hear that because we prefer to give out food, water, etc. But with our funders are giving us money, cash. We know who we give this to, of course. This is all clearly identified, but this is a way to help people to become more responsible. And it is good for people. Their conditions of living are so hard. We are giving them money, which they are receiving from abroad. And this is not something that they are going to take lightly or waste lightly. So this is an important aspect. We talked also about the refugees. These are people who left. We talk about displaced people who've been displaced, to move from one zone, one region to another within the same country, whereas refugees are people who actually left the country. They went to border countries. And we talked a lot about the surrounding countries such as Romania, Poland, Moldavia. Moldavia is part of Europe, not part of the EU. So this country does not really have the same conditions, the same standards than the other countries. So the way that the Ukrainian refugees were welcomed in Moldavia was really an example for all. So we've seen millions of people leaving the country very quickly. We were there to support all the refugees, first in Poland, then in Romania, then in Moldavia. We are the largest NGO on site, actually. So in those places, we had to do something to welcome the refugees. We are working in most of the African countries, in the Middle East as well, and we are working alongside one refugee out of 5 in the world. So we're used to doing this. Who are the refugees from the south? These are people who are leaving. We talked about weather disorder, because the rural populations, for example, have to get access to water. They have to go to pastures. So these are people who are leaving the regions because of wars and conflicts. So these are people who leave with their families. They take with them all their goods. And often it's not much, but they leave just to go to another places. And we welcome them in refugee camps. We comfort them. We bring first necessities. For refugees in Ukraine, this is totally different. Of course, they were not expecting war. We forgot that war could also happen in Europe. And those who left Ukraine were mainly women and children. As you know, men between the age of 18 and plus had to stay to fight. And older people, of course, who left alongside women and children. So men between the age of 18 to 60 had to stay. So we took charge not of families, but we took charge of women, older people. When you are with families, you have solidarity in Africa, in the Middle East. The idea of family is very important in terms of solidarity. We saw women and children arrive by themselves. Secondly, what's also an important point, which is different to other situations, is that those people left just for a few days or a few weeks or a few months. No one ever could imagine that these people, this population, would still be refugees 8 months later for some. So you have to adapt. This is an important part of our work. This is psychological work as well, which is very important in order to welcome the refugees. In Moldavia, as I was saying, this is a poor country. We are managing the over 100 welcome centers, refugee centers, and we had to create everything from scratch with the local authorities in order to welcome the refugees. In a nutshell, I would say that, of course, Europe was not prepared, ready for such a conflict. The people who found themselves in this situation were not prepared, not psychologically prepared to face this disaster. But we need to know that the disaster will continue. So we had to bring the first emergency necessities and needs. And we are also in a position or in a situation where we have to rebuild and rehabilitate. And especially with French companies, we are rehabilitating certain areas. We are working, for example, with Vinci, the French company, to rehabilitate places, venues, to give access to water. We are working with pipelines and with companies specialized in that. So we are working along rebuilding, and still there are still some emergency needs. You were talking about the particularity of the refugees, that there were mainly women, children, because the men had to stay behind. Any other particular aspect in this conflict, in the humanitarian response, which you had to bring compared to other conflicts which you dealt with in the past? The main particularity, of course, is the global mobilization, which we saw in this disaster. We saw a strong interest and very special interest. I'm saying this without provoking anyone. We are seeing other types of disasters in the corner of Africa, in Pakistan also, which people are not interested in. I'm not talking about individuals as such. I could be talking about some international NGOs or some states. In the Ukrainian crisis, we've seen a great mobilization of international public stakeholders in the West and in the North, and also of our citizens. We saw it here in France. I don't know if everyone knows about this, but we are a large NGO which is financed by states, by the EU, by the UN, and we've seen great mobilizations of our French citizens in order to support the Ukrainians. And so we've sent out humanitarian convoys, trucks, full trucks, to bring first necessities. So we have seen the great mobilization, and in this disaster we've seen the great international solidarity. We are working in 42 countries. Historically, in Europe, we're only working in Ukraine, but everywhere else in the world there is suffering, recurring suffering, sometimes increasing sufferings, and people are not interested, and that remains largely unknown. So the Ukrainian crisis for us is something very strong for these people. Because we're talking about refugees, of course, France has been a welcome land, a land of hospitality for hundreds of thousands of refugees. I was in Moldavia not so long ago. There were several thousands of refugees who went to Moldavia, went through Moldavia. Not all of them stayed in Moldavia, which is not the case of other refugees. For example, a Kenyan refugee who went, or from Uganda who went to Kenya, or from Somalia who went to Kenya, will stay there, knows that they will stay there sometimes months or years, maybe even tens of years. You have camps which represent hundreds of thousands of people. We do not have this in Europe. We do not see this at the Ukrainian border. Yet these people knew that they would actually find themselves in this situation, and they pray that they will be able to go back home at the right time. Ukrainians believe that at the right time they will be able to go back. Some have gone back, not very many though. However, as far as the humanitarian stakeholders are concerned, the truth is that France and Europe have become places of hospitality, but we are working with many other refugees who have been refugees for a much longer period and who would love to come to European countries and who are not welcomed. So this is something that should bring our attention, that should catch our attention. Indeed, welcoming refugees is something that we will talk with you now. Céline Beaujolin at Habitat and Humanism, you are used to welcoming refugees. What was different with the Ukrainian refugees? First of all, a few things have been mentioned already, but I think the difference here is that they had a special status, which was a temporary protection status, a European status, which opened up the door to pretty much everything, things which others did not have, and I will come back to this. For example, they had access to assistance, they had access to the rent support. They can be just housed with any other French citizen with the same conditions. This is really an opening to employment, an open door to housing and to employment. Okay, I won't talk more about this, but this is a special status. That's the first thing to mention. After 2 weeks' time, for example, they can get access to a house and a place to work. So this is the second aspect. These people actually arrived very quickly, a refugee. We have indeed welcomed a number of asylum seekers and refugees. Most of them come to France and arrive in France after a long period with some difficulties, with some hurdles. But these Ukrainian refugees arrive very quickly, just after a few days, compared to others who come here after several years, which means that the work of being here or being welcomed is not done in the same way. I think we have 100,000 refugees from Ukraine here in France for millions of refugees all together. So this is not the most attractive country for them. Yet they have a special status here. They have an easy access to everything. Second particularity is that we have mainly women and children, and also older people. We may also have women with some health issues and grandmothers who do not seek to settle here. This is a particularity. We do not have people who want to stay here. So talking about employment, but the main issue here is that these people do not speak French nor English, or very little, which is a big challenge. And what they are going to say is that they have their children, they want the children to go back to school. Kids are very quick at doing this, and they want their mothers to be welcome, to be well taken care of, and they want to hear from home. This is what is really close to their heart. So they have different expectations to the other refugees whom we're used to welcoming. Now, a third aspect is the solidarity, which we saw was very strong and very interesting as well, and which was very spontaneous. We used to seeing spontaneous actions, not so much at such a large scale. So we had to control this. We put the chart before the horses, but out of the 100,000 refugees in France, we still have about half of them, 50,000 of them, who do not have housing yet, solutions, who are not in a system, who do not have access to work, who are not part of a framework. So these people had to just do things by themselves. Quickly, we talk about the citizen hospitality. These are people like you and I who welcome the Ukrainian family. We were called a few days after the conflict, and they went to look for families and bring them from Poland, and they were hosted in families working at AXA. So this was very easy. This is an interesting aspect as well. So we have learned along the way, we realized along the way that welcoming people like them was actually a whole job in itself. We needed people who could speak the language, who knew about access to rights. This came in a second stage. This was the interesting part of it. Our other two participants here represent companies which have some contracts with Ukraine. Anne-Claire Giraud-Pouget, head of social commitment. Was that important for you to be able to identify partners, to quickly intervene? Yes, it was absolutely key and pivotal, going beyond the identification of partners. We already had regular discussions with partners. This was not the first time. We were looking at ways that a company like Chanel could have a positive impact or could help with a social commitment. So we already had ongoing discussions with specialists of social commitments, either specialists, but of course with the Ukrainian crisis, we had crisis to deal with in the past. Quickly, we were able to get into some discussions to identify the right partners. They are well known, actually, even though we don't always know all the NGOs. But very quickly, we started discussing with them. As you mentioned, the spontaneity, we saw this in a massive way. Maybe we can talk about this a bit later on with great exposure to the media. So very quickly, we looked at the needs of the NGOs. How do we wanted to help them? What were the main issues they were facing? I'm talking about just 10 days. I'm not talking about the first 2 days, but 10 days after the beginning of the crisis. Yes, we did have some experts to help us. We looked at the answers we could bring to meet the needs and looked at what Chanel could do, not as a brand, but as a responsible company, and I believe that all the companies do the same. This is not so much a matter of brand or products, but what could be our responsibility. And if we do want to have an impact, then we need to look for experts. Beyond expertise, we need to look for people who are on the field. We hear people, we see them, but it's really when we are on the field that we realize what is the reality. It goes beyond expertise in that sense. Yves Benchimol, I will let you explain to us what is Reward. You are funding humanitarian projects, humanitarian missions through your app Reward. The notion or the idea of positive impact is really at the heart of your economic model, but Ukraine made you change and yes, I'm a co-founder of an app called Reward. It's a mobile app which is giving money to people for walking. We want to encourage people to walk. Of course, this is an environmental reason and also a physical and health reason and also for local dynamism. What happened at the beginning of our company is that we were not giving money to people to walk. It's not a lot of money, yet people can earn a few euros per month. And quickly we had people who said, well, why not get 10 euros per month just because I've been walking for 2 months, but maybe I could support an organization as part of this. So in our model, we included organizations to whom people can give them money. What was special with Ukraine, right from the start of the conflict, people said they wanted to support this cause. Just to give you an idea, it's been multiplied by 10. We multiplied by 10 the number of bank wires to support the Ukrainian situation. First, we had to identify the right partners. As a startup, we could not go to Ukraine. Or I'm listening to Frédéric and all the actions that were taken by Acted, and so we chose the right actors. It's complicated when you give out money. You don't know how it's going to be used, but our role was to find out how would people be able to help, even by a few euros, how to have a greater impact and how to help people who had great needs. So we were therefore able to send a humanitarian convoy through the donations and gifts of millions of people. So through these amounts, what we felt was a great mobilization, unprecedented mobilization. I never saw in my generation a war for which people were so mobilized. So we gave people the opportunity to take action, even if only a few people were giving a few euros. For the first time, we saw that people were actually taking action to help support a cause and give to an NGO. And people were therefore able to talk about this, to feel involved in the conflict, and therefore to be better informed and to have more of an overview and to look at what was done on the field and get some feedback. As a startup, we included in our economic model the fact to be able of being able to support associations, and those people actually guided us to the actions which they want to support. Our roles, therefore, is to facilitate their desire to give and to select the right partners to maximize and optimize our impact. Yes, we saw that the impact was huge on the public. Céline Baugelin at Habitat and Humanism, was it difficult in the middle of all of these spontaneous initiatives to actually give some framework and some rules to this invasion of initiatives? I think it was well described. I agree to say that for us as an organism, as a body working with institutions, what happened is that people came to look for us, which was a new thing. It was something new to us. People came to look for us, to ask for our expertise, a different type of expertise, for example, a capacity to work on the field. We were called by city halls, by mayors who wanted to help Ukrainians and asked us to take care of it. We were also called by partners who did not know how to act. We almost did engineering to tell people, okay, you could do this, you could do that, this sounds interesting. This was something very new to us. Now the framework came afterwards. This is what I was saying earlier on. It is not completely a framework either, because half of the people are still functioning outside of the framework. Some people just welcome refugees directly in their homes. Now we're supposed to sign a contract with an association, so it's not very spontaneous. It's something we have difficulties appealing to. So we have a greater offer than we have demand. We could actually welcome more Ukrainians. And one of the challenges which needs to be mentioned is that we should not add difficulty to the difficulty. There is a desire to welcome Ukrainian refugees everywhere in France, not just in the larger cities, not necessarily in the Paris region. There is a necessity to welcome refugees in other regions, but people are also confronted to other populations who are confronted to similar challenges. So from an ethic point of view, this is an interesting thing to talk about. We did not act immediately because we were waiting to hear what was happening. We were waiting to hear back from our supporters, our funders, but we raised a lot of questions, ethical questions. And this is a special moment we're going through. I don't know if I answered your question properly. Yes, indeed. Now, coming back to what, Céline, you were saying earlier on, the way that things have changed, the relationship with the public changed. Rather than calling for funds, you had to look at the way to handle all the donations. Normally, we don't call for gifts or donations. Other NGOs do this. Of course, this was a different story for us. 99.5% of our funds are committed on the ground to help the poorest populations, and this is international public money. Therefore, this money that has been given to us has been trusted in our hands, and therefore we are trying to implement the right program. So this is a different story for us. We are clearly identified by public actors, local actors. Often we work in conflict areas. We are the main NGO in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine as well. So if things don't go well with one particular partner, we will not reach the population. This is our historical model. what's happening today is that people feel more concerned, feel more open and receptive to suffering. People realize that they do have a good life in France and are more sensitive to others' suffering. So we have potential donors who do want to be more involved and more committed. And even though they might not be as generous, everyone wants to commit somehow. France has a strong commitment through associations. So the humanitarian action, such as ACTED, which was not very well known, is not so unknown anymore. Therefore, we are wondering whether we should be changing slightly our model or not so much to receive more funds, but also to be able to welcome all those donors. Always before we had pretty much the same donors, the French government, the various institutions, but now we are talking about several hundreds, even millions of donors, local actors, local stakeholders, local authorities, individuals as well. But besides the financial aspect, people actually want to take part in programs. And this is something pivotal for us. Something which must be mobilized beyond ACTED. People who are going to fund ACTED will want to know what's happening. So we are no longer calling for public donations, but we want people who are giving, who are maybe employees of Chanel, because Chanel is committed in a consistent way. And now the employee of Chanel can say, I'm going to continue this action by giving. So this employee, this person will be more interested in what we are doing on the field. So this is more valorizing for us. We have over 7,000 employees, local employees, who are very happy to get involved. And when they hear and when they know that from far from France, they are helping, and whatever the amount of the gift, this is something that's very important. So I think that humanitarian action as it is actually more complete. Of course, there is the historical participation of our historical funders, but also to have funding from people who are part of this great solidarity movement, who know exactly where the money is going. This is something that is really valuable to us. This is something that is really encouraging us to go further. And the role of employees, when we talk about humanitarian actions, we talk about refugees, displaced populations, but the role of employees in humanitarian action is really pivotal. We are only working in countries where local employees are helping us to identify the beneficiaries, to understand the countries, because they may be cousins or neighbors. So we are not making any mistakes when we carry out our actions. And for these employees to know and to find out that they are being supported by other organizations, other structures, be it private or public, it's something that is very important to us.
So to add to what you said, I compared what happened with Habitat Humanism and other players that do something similar to us. Economic model relies on donors and public actors. And there are other public operators, and they ask themselves a lot of questions. So the state said, go for it, we will pay. And it lasted for a few weeks only. And I saw it with other operators. They wondered whether they were able to carry out the mission. We said to our association, go for it, we will give you the funds that you are lacking. So this is not exactly the same pattern, and we felt freer to have people involved in the field. We work with a lot of volunteers, I will not promote volunteering, but of course it gives us an additional extraordinary capacity. Moderator. So I'm talking here as a journalist. Were there any issues? The fact that this crisis was high profile in the media. For Ukraine, it's been great. At some point, as field players, we told our donors we have to refrain from getting more funds. So we all remember what it's like to have too much money when there was the tsunami. Because there is the time for action, but there is a time for the urgency response. There is a time for rebuilding. So there are different steps, but we are not yet there. We're not about to rebuild Ukraine. We are interested in crises when it is an urgent situation, and then we forget about them. I remember the situation in Nepal with in 2015. Many French players and others were highly involved. There was a lot of funding for an emergency response to help people fit themselves, accommodate themselves. But after a few months after the earthquake, because we all know that an earthquake is not like conflict, there is no funding left for rebuilding the country. So when they needed funds to rebuild bridges, roads, etc., there were no funds left. So that's what matters. There are emotions involved, sensitivities. I remember talking to media and calling for a lot of help from French people going to Nepal, but we never saw those funds. I don't know what will happen with the Ukraine, but we shouldn't be interested in the crisis during the emergency and then forget about it. When I talk about the African Horn, no one is interested in it because it's far away. The UN said this morning that we will face an important famine throughout the world. So we will see harrowing pictures in the next few weeks, but just like with what happened with Somalia or Ethiopia, we will forget about those crises. In Pakistan, we know that they are being flooded, and they were flooded 10 years ago. So we should make sure our response is coordinated, organized, because there are monsoons, there are areas flooded, but in those countries we don't have great funding for rehabilitation and rebuilding of main infrastructures. Céline, we have noticed phenomenon because of this, the fact that this crisis was high profile in the media. This created a bottleneck. So we saw it internally. We received irrational requests. It was great to see so much generosity, but then we had to frame those donations and requests. Some wanted to go to the border to help families, but then we felt overwhelmed internally. So how can we have long-term partnerships to frame demand and support people? And how can we help with those silence crises, as you've mentioned? So how can we work with you in the long run, and not only in terms of when it's urgent? Moderator, did this high-profile situation make it more difficult for you to act? Cillian, we have been working with Afghan people, and this has been quite complex. As managers, we had to work with social workers, and this was extremely difficult, especially for them to bear this responsibility. So to remain positive, we did things that we had never done before, and we would like for this to be fruitful. Could we reap the fruits of what we have done? And let's hope that this brings about an approach that will help refugees wherever they are throughout the world. This issue was quite tangible, and that was working hand in hand with the state. We tried to make headway for Ukrainians, but also for Afghans. So what works is long-term partnerships. We now have patrons that we've been working for a long time, but we need to continue along those lines. Moderator. Yves, with WeWord, you've worked on other humanitarian aspects. Was it important for you to focus on the Ukraine, but not only? Yves, the fact that this crisis is high profile will help us reach out more people. We've received tens of thousands of micro donations. So I think we have this capacity to reach out millions of people and to promote such causes. So we also have tax credits, tax cuts for people who make donations. But for them to support us, they need to be informed, and they need to be confident their donations will be well used. So we are here to tell them we have selected a partner, we have discussed with them, and if you make a donations to them, your money will be well used. We've worked on a large project in Africa, and we gave a lot of money there. It was for a school of refugees in Nigeria, and help more specifically 800 pupils. So people are there, information is there and needs to be disseminated. We are a bit like an influencer because we have tens of thousands of users. And we know that some people will be more sensitive than others. So some people will make higher donations for certain causes, others will be lower. So more people make donations for Ukrainians because it is close to our European borders, and also because there are reliable partners involved in helping those refugees. So let's not forget that people will make donations when they are thoroughly informed. Moderator. People can make donations when they trust the partners, as you said. So, of course, there are people taking benefit of this conflict. There are actors that are non-virtuous. So how did you select your partners? And Claire, we have a legal department that is of assistance to us. As a company, we hand out money, but we also hand out time. We send people over to help associations. So, of course, we need to protect our company and our employees. But it also means protecting our beneficiaries. Most of the time, NGOs have pre-drafted agreements, so we discuss those together. And after working in HR for years, I'm used to looking at key criteria to see whether or not the partners are politically neutral, religiously neutral. Those criteria are crucial to us, and I think this is the case for many companies. And if we have reporting tools, this can help us because we need to remain accountable, of course. So the interaction that we have with you, with other NGOs, and the relationship that we have with those NGOs that goes beyond those criteria also matters. But we have a legal framework to take into account as well. Moderator. Eve, what's your opinion? Eve, yeah, of course, there are legal dimensions to take into account. Associations have already put things in place, so we try to do the same. And then we launch projects. We do not only hand out money for the Ukraine, for example. We first send a convoy, for instance, and we can fund that many kilometers of walk, for instance. Most of the time, maybe not for a company like Chanel, but for a startup like us, we select the funds. We will not use any company to get funds. We have been working with Unifem France to help Ukrainian women and children who are refugees. And this gives us statistics as well. So, and they're being consistent in how they collect funds and how they use them. So those associations make sure they have a correct selection process, and then we will do so as well. In Nigeria, we have worked with a local association for this school because they already built a school well. So we were reassured. We just didn't want to send money being blindfolded. So it's not easy to trust someone that is so far away. So thanks to the association, we made sure the funds were rightly used. And then we got feedback from this operation. And then people want to make donations again. Moderator. Frédéric, you've been working with local partners in the Ukraine. How did you select them, especially in the, when it's an emergency? Was it because of your network? Yes, we act in the same way everywhere. We work with local associations that have the necessary skills. So we collect the funds internationally and work hand in hand with local associations. We've worked with Ukrainian associations and those groups that were created at the time of the conflict and that were the perfect fit for us. Let me go back to one thing in particular. We need to forget about humanitarian business. I'm being very clear here. We are one of the main NGO present in the Ukraine. We've asked for private and public partners' help for one reason. The money that we give right now is not money from Acted, because then we will be funded by international donors. Right now, we have 100 million euros, but that we don't have them into our bank account. But the tens of millions of euros will arrive. So we've noticed how important it is to forge an alliance with our partners, our generous donors. But the crisis in the Ukraine has been so high profile that it involved many associations and other structures that were not present in the Ukraine. So I would like to underline the fact that it's of the utmost importance to know the communities in the field. What we brought in the trucks is part of a list that we drafted with local authorities in the Ukraine. Among those essentials being needed by refugees, there were animal feed. So you cannot go see your potential partners and tell them they need animal feed. But the reality is that the people were not to flee their houses without their pet. So it's important to have this relationship with local players. We need to bear in mind that people had to flee their homes, flee their jobs, flee their country. So we need to make sure we meet their needs. What matters when selecting a partner is the humanitarian presence in the field. If you want to act in Botswana, you have to be there to take action. We are taking action in the field. People in the field know us, and when we take action in a country where we are not present, like in Bangladesh, it was an instruction from one of our donors, the HCR, for example. Because we had worked with us to help the Rohingyas in Burma, so that's why we went there after receiving their instruction. But you have to be in the field to actually take action. And this is something that has been irritating in past crises. Secondly, we often think that humanitarian players are volunteers. ACTED is in 42 employees, is in 42 countries, but we are not volunteers, we are employees, because to implement our programs are so large that we need employees to be working on those. So professionalism needs to be one of the main drivers of this relationship that we create with public and private partners. So this is why we made the decision a few years back to work with local authorities, because some departments in France have a partnership with different countries. There are cities that are twinned with other cities in other countries. Some can be highly committed when it comes to sustainability, so they can help us, assist us, and teach us things. At work in Paris, we've created sponsorships, patronage operations, especially in IT, and we learned a great deal. But we work in highly insecure regions. So we cannot have Robert Durand engineer in the south of France and go to a conflict-ridden zone. So, of course, our employees have a good will, but we live in a dangerous world. So we need to have an honest discussion with our partners, and that is being present in the field, be professional, moderator. Céline, you take action not in the Ukraine but in France, but is it also difficult for you to find virtuous partners? Céline, no, it hasn't been difficult. Our partners came to us because I think we are credible when it comes to our expertise. We also managed to combine local action and central action. We work with the last mile, and we are able to make the link between the different players. And this is important to have a federation. The federation talks with the players and has a network clout. And I think our partners came to us because they knew we had this network and that we were in touch with local partners. We already have a lot of skills, but it would be great to have even more skills. But what matters is our expertise and our ability to network. Moderator. After seeing this urgent situation of the crisis, this conflict seems to be here to stay. So what do you think the future will hold? Frédéric, there is another reality I would like to focus on. Public international donors, sorry to focus on this, but it matters to us. When there is a crisis like in the Ukraine, those donors make billions in donations. Of course, we need to take those billions somewhere. So we do not take them out of the pocket of individual people. The official development assistance of France is still very low. So we try to hire, we start to work, and then we hear we don't have the funds. So donors who waited for the details of the program are now being told that the project is being postponed. But this crisis in the Ukraine is so large. It has involved many public investments at the expense of other crises, and that is a reality. Moderator, let's underline that when you are given funds for the Ukraine, you cannot use it for other crises. So there are funds, Frédéric, there are funds for the Ukrainian crisis. But when there are other crises, we cannot use them. Secondly, the funds that we are being given by the donors is for the Ukraine. And it's even more specific. It is for one region in the Ukraine. And if we have to hand out food, then we can't hand out health essentials, for example. Otherwise, we have to work with the donor to reallocate those funds. But the donors we've been working for are long-time donors, so we have this great relationship with them. And of course, we have reporting obligations, audit obligations. So this relationship with the donor has to be flexible. When we have such funds for the Ukraine, and then we hear, okay, we have enough funds for the Ukraine and we need to reallocate those funds to another crisis, the new partner will say our employees are involved for the Ukraine and not for another crisis. So I may have a difficult time understanding why we want to reallocate the funds. So we need to benefit from our partners in this flexible relationship. Taking action in other countries suffering is also important. The funds that we collected for the Ukraine came from different countries. Moderator, this conflict in the Ukraine was the foundation for other partnerships for Chanel? Anne-Claire, yes, we are working on this flexibility with our partners. The crisis of Ukraine was not the starting point of those partnerships, but this is one of the most visible crises internally and externally. So we are strategically rethinking our models. You said that you needed flexibility, but I need to rethink our model when it comes to partnerships and the impact we want to have. So, of course, we're having we're discussing with ACTED and other NGOs, and we want to see where we can be flexible. Of course, we have an image accountability, and there are reasons where we cannot go for political and religious reasons, as I said. But then when I ask the question internally, why are we doing this? The answer is that we're not doing this for our image, especially not in my department. We are doing this to have an impact. So if we go back to this question, why are we doing this? Then we move forward. We try to avoid the bottleneck that we created with the Ukraine, because many other companies did the same and made huge donations. So now I'm saying what is the reasonable amount of funds to hand out for the impact we want to have. So of course it will help for future partnerships. And over lunch we've talked about this. For example, with L'Oréal, we said that we needed to raise awareness when it comes to partnerships, and not only think in KPIs. So I think it is highly positive and beneficial, because we are asking ourselves the right questions beyond this partnership that a help will develop. Moderator. Céline, you're hoping that this conflict will lay the foundations for future partnerships, future positive partnerships? Céline. Yes, we hope that the response that we got for Ukraine will be the same for future crises. Although Ukrainian refugees are not many, the response was great. So we are hoping that the government will be as proactive for future crises. So for us, it's great to have feedback and sort information, see what we can expand. The situation is changing. The war has been going on for over 6 months now. Supporting a family that has been here for 6 months is quite different from helping a family in an urgent situation. And when it comes to flexibility, we created a Ukrainian fund. We asked local associations what they needed. Now we are going back to them and ask them again what they need, because now some have learned French, so they have different needs. And this is what we need to tell our funders. And now we need to talk with them, see whether or not we can use the funds in a different way. So we need to have this discussion with our financial partners and the governments. Moderator, has this conflict allowed for new action methods? Frédéric, yes, it was totally new. We did not work in France. Only 5 years ago, we had an example of action in France, but otherwise, public actors need to work on fighting against poverty. So this crisis in the Ukraine helped us create this convoy initiative. So we had public players, like city halls, government, etc., that were organizing fundraising, and private players that wanted to fund trucks. It allowed us to send 100 trucks, go through Europe so that it reaches our logistical factory in Poland. This organization was well oiled, and we wanted to look at the environmental impact of our commitment so that it could be offset. And we also saw French people being involved with their local authorities to raise funds, logistics technicians, drivers, etc. So many people were involved, and that was great for us to do. And then we tried to be quite firm. The first donations, as I said, were part of a list that we drafted with local authorities. And unfortunately, there was not always a follow-up. And French people gave us what they had left in their backyard. And so the donations we got were awful. So then we sent a clear message, and then things were better organized later on. And it was much more fruitful. And then at some point we wondered whether those convoys were useful. But once again, we were glad to see that France was involved. So this was a great operation.
So one last thing. If we carried out this action, it was at the request of the Association of the Mayors of France. 35,000 municipalities. Everyone knows about the civil protection. With thousands of volunteers, they were the one who started this work. So civil protection, for several reasons, asked to stop this operation, and we developed a partnership with the AMF, the Association of the Mayors, who asked us if our volunteers could actually help us. But we do not have volunteers in France. We have hundreds of employees, but we decided to do the job, and we did it because people took their responsibilities. We had generous donors who stopped sending rubbish donations. We had wonderful packaging work. We had some financing from the private donors, and therefore it was a successful program. I want to be as concrete as you are. Things that we would like to see happen. For example, in France, people are being housed. Many of those people are in hotels. It's very expensive to have people staying in hotels, and we cannot really help them. So what we are doing now is that we are putting people in private apartments, and this is a different approach altogether. This is something that we have just experienced with refugees. Why not have direct access for refugees, access to private housings, so that we can help them without having to wait for months in hotels, which are not appropriate. This is what we would like to see happen. Maybe one last word from you, Yves Benchimol, regarding some feedback. We acted through sending a humanitarian convoy. When we are working with an association, it's a partner, it's not a supplier, and we are remaining flexible as to the way the money is going to be sent or used. We are not on the field, so we don't know much. Just one last word regarding our feedback. We're saying it's not about a brand, it's about impact, but a company that has a great impact will benefit from it. As a company CEO, what I'm seeing is that people are coming to work with us because of our reputation. People have photos of what we do in Nigeria, what we do in Ukraine, and people can feel more committed and more involved. So we do see an indirect consequence or link. People, when they come to work with us, are also coming for this reason, because they want to make sense in what they're doing. So it's difficult to say that we have no interest in doing this, even though we are not doing this for that reason, but yet it does have some benefits, which could be more than what we can expect. So we're very happy to be involved in these kind of actions. This is something which we'll continue to do, and people who are working with us want to do that. What about you at Chanel? I will invite you to come and speak to our people here at Chanel. You do a great pitch. This is what motivates me indeed in the morning when I hear all of our collaborators, to see how our mindset is changing, and it's been changing for the last 10 years really. what I'm learning from Chanel, it's the way that we respect competencies and skills, the way that we know how to be humble. We don't know everything, and it's important to recognize this. Crisis management is something very specific, especially in times of war, and I think it's important that we can all realize that we all have a role to play and we can complement one another. And a generosity is really a common thread for all. Would you like to say something else? Would you like to add a word regarding the crisis in Ukraine and humanitarian aid? Yes, once again, we want to take interest in Ukraine, not just today in this emergency situation, but tomorrow also to reconstruct and rebuild Ukraine. If we do not have finances to rebuild Ukraine, Ukraine will become a poor country, whereas it was a developing country. We should not forget the negative impact as well. Ukraine has improved its GPI greatly. When Ukrainians came to Moldavia, there was a great gap because Moldavians do not have the same living standard as Ukrainians. If you come to Moldavia to help Ukrainians with some funds, and Moldavians who have a much lower standard of living, this is something that is very complicated. We have to be very careful, to be cautious, to not bringing disorder or imbalance. We will have to monitor this Ukrainian crisis in the long run to rebuild the country. There are some imbalances. For example, a Ukrainian refugee is not the same as a refugees from Sudan and from Somalia, and that causes a great imbalance, of course. And if we look at Ukraine compared to Moldavia, we are seeing some constant gaps and discrepancies which cause a lot of frustration. The crisis in Ukraine has increased the lack of food and first necessities. Rent has increased greatly, for example. Don't think that people will welcome you because you live on the other side of the border. They do it out of brotherhood and fraternity. But when things continue to last in the long run, you will see some gaps and discrepancies. So we want to make sure that this situation will stop as quickly as possible, so that the refugees who want to go back to Ukraine will be able to do so in order to stop strengthening or enhancing these gaps. Similarly, I would like to say that there are three risks. There is a risk of competition, and also we need to look at the way that we organize things here in France. We have a high public concentration in some areas, and there is a lot to be done. We need to be able to welcome people in the best places possible. And this is difficult to do because we do not have a midterm vision. Also, if we decided not to do a call for donations, specifically for Ukraine, it was because we did not want to stop the ongoing flow of donations. We will see what will happen at the end of the year, but this is a challenge for us. We're working on this issue of people here in France who are not housed properly, and we will see how it goes in the future. Thank you, everyone, for taking part in this roundtable. Thank you for taking part in this panel. Thank you for listening to us. And we hope that we have opened up a dialogue to talk about partnerships between NGOs and how to welcome Ukrainian refugees, but not only. Thank you.